name's Anna Reynolds and I'm the Lord Mayor of Hobart. I'm very pleased and proud to be here tonight to be the MC for this wonderful event. On behalf of Beaker Street, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Tasmanian Aboriginal people, members of the oldest continuing culture in the world. The Tasmanian Aboriginal people have passed along an unbroken chain of ancient knowledge of the animals, plants, waterways and skies of Lutruwita. We honour this wisdom and we are grateful to be able to come together on this land to discover and share knowledge. So I'd like everyone to give a big, warm Hobart welcome to our special guests, Professor Tim Flannery and Robyn Williams. Now I'm going to leave things to Tim and Robyn in just a moment, but before I do, just to provide a very brief introduction of two people that probably don't need too much introduction, but for those of you who would like a reminder that Professor Tim Flannery, FAA, is a Chief Councillor at the Climate Council and one of Australia's leading writers on climate change. An internationally acclaimed scientist, explorer and conservationist, Professor Flannery was named Australian of the Year in 2007. Tim has also held a number of academic positions, including the Principal Research Scientist at the Australian Museum, and of course many of you would be aware of his fabulous books, including Here on Earth in 2010 and The Weathermakers in 2005. And Professor Robyn Williams, AOFAA, is very much one of Australia's best-known science journalists and broadcasters. Robyn was telling me that the science show, which he's been hosting for nearly 48 years now, so there you go. A remarkable achievement, and also Occam's razor. So outside the ABC, Robyn has served in various capacities, including President of the Australian Museum Trust, Chairman of the Commission for the Future, President of the Australian Science Communicators, and in 1987 he was proclaimed a National Living Treasure. Hand over to Tim and Robyn, and we are hearing about how to connect with the unconvinced. So these two legendary science communicators are going to have a conversation with each other about how to change minds in a world of denialism, disinformation and deep fakes. Over to you.
Thank you, Anna. A colleague of Tim's calls me a national living fossil. Slightly nearer the mark.
Which colleague is that? Robyn?
Paul Willis.
Really? Oh, well,
used to be on Catalyst.
He's a rude young fellow, take no notice.
Extremely rude. However, when it comes to changing someone's mind, I was once asked to go on television with somebody called Nick Minchin, who used to be the Minister for Science and was famous for being completely against most of the information coming out of climate scientists. And I refused, because I knew somehow it was going to be a waste of time. And Anna Rose, whom you know, who was leading the youth climate scientists, and very, very bright, very amenable, she did it instead. And the most incredible experience, I knew it was going to happen somehow. Instead of her being matched by him, when it came to having guests. In other words, she chose scientists, and he chose the most rabid sort of propagandists. Amazing. And what I couldn't understand, and maybe you can answer because you knew him, I think, or still do, that if you're a minister for science and a minister for other things, you would be, when the doors are closed, advised by the top experts on whatever is crossing your mind, and you'd be given the truth. And you would decide policy against the truth. What do you think of that story?
Oh, well, Robyn, it goes to the heart of the issue we're here to discuss this evening, really. Look, I lived in Adelaide for 7 years and got to know Nick Minchin very well. And I must say, I like the man as a person.
So did I.
He was a really decent human being, is a decent human being, and I enjoyed his company. And we were able to speak one-to-one, you know, off the record about various issues, mostly around climate change. And I remember speaking to him, it must have been about 2005 or 2006, when the US Navy had produced projections on the reduction of the Arctic ice cap, saying that, you know, it's likely that there will be no Arctic ice cap sometime between 2030, 2035. And I said to Nick at that point, well, you know, this is the US Navy, these are hardly left-wing idiots, you know, doing this projection. What do you make of this? And if it comes true, what would you say? And he looked at me and said, well, if there is an ice-free Arctic summer before 2035, it would give your side tremendous ammunition, he said. I said, well, what would it mean to you? He said, it wouldn't change my view. And I said, well, what would change your view, Nick, if that wouldn't? And he said, nothing. Nothing will change my view. And I realised at that point that as he said that, I watched his face, because he realised that this is where the great fault lay in his way of thinking.
Did you see why nothing would change his view?
I didn't pursue it any further because I could see in his face as he said that he realised the folly, I think, of that, or the limitations of that view. I mean, I might be wrong, but that's what I thought I saw.
Yeah.
You know, Nick is driven by ideology. He's not interested in facts, he's interested in ideology.
There was
and
one
ideology
occasion,
creates
yeah, you're
facts,
quite
you know.
right, yeah. A person who was like that from the States, who had not only debunked climate science, but he'd also been pro-tobacco and cigarettes. And when I interviewed him, I said, look, whatever you think of the beginnings and the contradictions that may still appear, this is 20 years ago, in climate science, tobacco, you know, Sir Richard Dole published that wonderful paper in the British Medical Journal, what's it now, 70 years ago? And there have been any number of papers since then, besides which half your relatives are dying, and you know what goes on. And he said, yes, I know that. But even though I know that, the prospect with the Greenies of getting world government is even worse. So we will argue against those anti-things till we can't argue anymore. You know, world government, they're worried about you being in the world government.
Well, I'm according to Bronwyn Bishop, I'm the new the high priest of the new green Satanism. Just where I am. But look, put all that aside, Robyn, could I just make a point here that when we talk to people who are opposed to our views, it's good to understand where they're coming from. So, you know, I've spoken to tens of thousands of people about climate change, you know, in public forums or one-on-one. And, you know, they fall into three categories as far as I'm concerned. There's the ones who are paid to be sceptics, the Andrew Bolts of the world. And why would you put yourself out of a job, right? You're going to go to the very end, right? And then there's the ideologues, people like Nick Minchin, who for ideological reasons have a particular view. Very rarely they may change their mind. Who knows why or how, but it may happen. And then there's simply the undecided, not the undecided, but those who lack adequate access to information to make a reasoned decision. And that's where we can, through honest and respectful dialogue, make a difference, in my view.
Can you maintain your respect during that dialogue?
You look, I still respect Nick Minchin on many levels. None of us are perfect, you know. It's like expecting a sporting star to be perfect in every way. You know, we see them in the paper arraigned for all sorts of things every day. All they can do is kick a football. Well, you know, but that's great, so they should, but we can't expect more of them. And so Nick, I know he has a blind spot around climate change and ideology, otherwise he's a decent human being. Can I just tell you a story, Robyn, about that? When I was Climate Commissioner for 3 years, I went all around regional Australia talking to people about climate change. And we ended up going into central Queensland, Gladstone area, and the hinterland of Gladstone at one stage. And I was Climate Commissioner, we had my fellow commissioners with us. we had an audience of about 200 people. George Christensen was lounging around in the front row with a few kind of heavyweights trying to distract us, you know. I remember Will Steffen spoke for 10 minutes very eloquently about climate change, and then I got up and said, look, but really this is your evening. This is your chance to ask us questions and work through this issue in some meaningful way. You know, looked at the audience, there was one hand went up, you know, for question time, and there was a bloke, he was about 6'6". I could see the coal dust in his skin, right? I thought, bloody hell, he's trouble. You know, one of us is going to get walloped, he'll run up and do something. But he stood up and said, look, thank you for your words about climate change. He said, I was a farmer a while back, and he said, I understand now that one of the reasons that I went broke was a more variable climate. And he said, but I've got 2 young daughters, and I had to get a job, and I'm now working in a coal mine. He said, can you tell me, am I doing the right thing? And it was one of those moments when you realise you can reach out to people. You can make a difference if you treat people respectfully and actually have a genuine dialogue. And you've got to go into that dialogue, Robyn, with a view that my mind is open to change as well.
Fine. Let me give an example of no respect. This is a quotation, I think some people may have heard of Aldous Huxley. He wrote a book called Brave New World. Was it going to be very brave? And he said this, it is man's intelligence that makes him so often behave more stupidly than the beasts. Man is impelled to invent theories to account for what happens in the world. Unfortunately, he's not quite intelligent enough, in most cases, to find correct explanations, so that when he acts on his theories, he behaves very often like a lunatic. Thus, no animal is clever enough when there is drought to imagine that the rain is being withheld by evil spirits or as punishment to his transgressions. Therefore, you never see animals going through the absurd and often horrible fooleries of magic and religion. No horse, for example, would kill one of its own foals to make the wind change direction. Dogs do not ritually urinate in hope of persuading heaven to do the same and send down rain. Asses do not bray a liturgy to cloudless skies. Nor do cats attempt, by abstinence from meat, to wheedle the feline spirits into benevolence. Only man behaves with such gratuitous folly. It is the price he has to pay for being intelligent, but not as yet intelligent enough. Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, but not very brave. He went to Eton, of course, so what do you think?
Look, I think, Robyn, that Aldous Huxley belonged to a slightly different world to the world we're in today. You know, Karl Popper has come up since, and I'm a Popperian. I have a view of science which is very much informed by Popper, and Popper says we can never know anything. We cannot know anything in science. We can't prove anything in science.
Absolutely.
Give me an apple and I'll drop it. You cannot ever say that one day, if I drop it 1 billion times, that apple won't go up. You cannot prove that the apple will never go up. Right?
But that's a conjuring trick, because that means you can never be absolutely sure about things, and therefore you can never be confident about taking decisions.
That is true. But the other side of that argument, Robyn, is that we can disprove things.
Which
we
is
can
the
show
Popperian line.
Theory is false, right? So that's the way science progresses, is by disproving things. We can never prove anything, right? And this is very much the way that I view science and see it. We can calculate probabilities of things, which is very important, but we can never prove anything will be, right? So I think that if you take that view, rather than the view that we're not intelligent enough, we're intelligent enough to calculate probabilities. I mean, you and I, Robyn, we've both had children, we've paid for expensive educations, and, you know, have you calculated the probability that would make any difference? You know, we all live with enormous uncertainty in the world, right? All the time. But we live in a world of calculated probability. That's why we cross the street every day, why we eat, why we do everything. It's calculated probability. So that is a more sensible approach to me than that idea that perhaps we're not intelligent enough to...
Let me give you one more quotation. It's actually from the Australian newspaper,
So that's my
This
favourite.
week-
I read it every morning, Robyn.
Adam Creighton.
At least the headlines. Oh, yes.
Headline: Experts feel the heat of latest climate panic.
I'm surprised it's not about the cricket, Robyn. It's usually the front page of the Australian.
A couple of little paragraphs, and then I'll make a comment and see whether you agree. How many scientists agree with something in public is irrelevant to the truth, especially when the vast bulk of agreeing scientists depend on government agencies such as the IMF, who insist on a particular narrative being presented. Plenty of eminent scientists do dispute the climate Armageddon narrative, but are ignored or ridiculed, in turn making it less likely that dissenters will speak out. Now, that's got the kind of numbers game there. In other words, they argue that it's not a case of saying 97.5% of scientists agree. That's not the point. You're not deciding the evidence by plebiscite. What's more important, and we mentioned Paul Willis briefly, we talked about something called consilience. In other words, that you have several, 20, 30 different lines of evidence. And when it comes to climate science, you've got the chemistry of the atmosphere, you've got the physics, you've got the behaviour of birds, you've got any number, the sound going through the ocean. You know, there are 20, 30 different, completely separate lines of investigation, and they all add up to the same conclusion.
And not to mention that the projections have now proved to be true and accurate.
You look around you.
Yes, exactly. The world we live in is the world that was projected 20 years ago.
But when you look around you, you are in, as a human being, you say nothing is absolute. As human beings, we make decisions about risk and how you will judge your own risk as a civilised society.
Look, could I just start, Robyn, by saying that that first sentence you read by Adam Creighton was tremendously long and convoluted. And it was quite, I think, was there to deceive. Because who is Adam Creighton? He's someone who is paid to deceive. That's his role, right? That's why he's writing for The Australian and is paid to write such stories. But, you know, they mentioned something about the IMF, International Monetary Fund. So
conspiracy.
Exactly, like a trigger point for people to listen to. I'd love to read it again just to go through it. There was about 5 or 6 trigger points in it for the kind of half-convinced conspiracists to think, yes, this is the way it is. Yeah. But, you know, The Australian will continue to argue that point simply because it pays them to do it. They've curated and carefully created a group of people who think that the sun shines out of the Australian's backside, that they are the font of all truth, you know. And those people, they're increasing their age. They're probably even older than us, Robyn, most of them on average, terrible as that might seem. And that will go on. Now, I don't know whether it's worth me wasting my time trying to deal with that sort of morass of stuff, because you'll defeat that argument and then another one will be produced. Like the classic I read today in The Australian, maybe yesterday, was that we shouldn't be building new transmission lines for new, or we shouldn't even be building solar farms or wind farms, because all of that money is going to come out of the regional roads budget and the regional health budget, and we'll have much less of the things we need, you see, with all this money being spent on dealing with climate change. You know, so by the time you've got your head around that and dealt with that, another lie will come up. And so this is the thing, the merchants of doubt, as Naomi Klein, I think it was, called them, are endlessly inventive, and we can't afford to waste our time chasing them down. What we have to deal with is the person who genuinely has an open mind, but who has insufficient information to make a decision.
And that starts at school, when we should be teaching young people critical thinking, so they can tell us when we're talking bullshit.
Exactly, scepticism is what we need to teach at school.
How do you do that?
By opening yourself up, I suppose, to criticism. One has to be, you know, we can't hide behind some shield of virtue. We have to open ourselves up. We all make mistakes. I mean, I know as a scientist I've made mistakes. It really helps to admit them, you know, and to then move on.
Have you been to school, talked to young people and said, you know, how do you criticise various statements you hear there or somewhere else?
Well, look, it depends on how old they are, but the really young ones, it's, you know, the job is, I think, just to foster the wonder of science and the wonder of nature, you know, to open our minds up to this incredible world we live in and how wondrous and complex and unexpected it is. You know, as kids get older, once they're in their teens, yeah, there is a job there to be done to foster the sort of scepticism that is required. I remember when I went to university, I did an arts degree, Robyn, and we had a lecturer who came in and was giving a crazy lecture. There was a guest lecturer came in. It was totally unexpected what he was talking about. It was supposed to be about Shakespeare. It was about something totally different. And there was someone in the background dressed in a gorilla suit who walked across the stage. And at the end of it, he asked how many people had noticed the person in the gorilla suit. And I think a rather small number of us had. The rest of us were so enchanted with this crazy act going on with the lecturer in the front of the room that we'd failed to notice the gorilla in the room. I mean, that kind of stuff is good for young people to see.
May I say this is why Beaker Street is so important? Because here you're introducing science on many, many levels, in the street, in the community, in ways where old and young can take part. That's the future, it seems to me. And, you know, critical thinking can be done in all sorts of ways. I remember you got something to do with climate to some extent, but the war on waste, our friend Craig Rucastle on television at the moment, he went to Kayama High School, it's up the road from where I live at the moment. I'm in a place called Giro, which is called Meeting Place for Birds, and about 15 species turn up for breakfast every day on my deck. Anyway, at Kayama High, they did these wonderful programs, 3 of them, and as Craig Rucastle said, if you want to do something about climate change, waste is key to it, and you can make a difference. And we can do an experiment where you do various things according to the rules with sorting and recycling and so on, and we can save, as it turned out, when they announced the result at the end of the programme, at the end of the series, they'd saved, I think, $90,000 for the school, and they'd saved 90% of what went into landfill. Then the teacher left school, and it all stopped. In other words, the kids are waiting to do something practical that makes sense, that can be a sort of game. And that kind of investment, if we have teachers who are not working for 90% of their time doing paperwork, you know, that'll make a huge difference, I think. Do you agree?
Look, I very much do. I think we live in a bit of a different world to the one I grew up in today. There is, I want to say it without seeming too rash, but there is now a very large managerial class which absorbs a huge amount of time and energy, and that goes down to the school level of having to fill out forms and do all the rest of the precautionary stuff, whereas in my day, brother would just give you the strap and that'd be the end of it, you know. It was a pretty straightforward and simple system, really. A bit brutal, I admit. I don't agree with it entirely. I was a victim of it, but these days, no, it's not like that. And it does take an exceptional human being, perhaps, to energise a school to minimise its waste, which is not ideal. It would be great if the head of the education department was that being, you know, who would then do that. But that's not the world we live in. We live in a different world, and it's change is slow compared with what is required.
I'll give you another example, which is on the same sort of scale, from the Harry Butler Institute in Perth. And I talked to somebody called Grey Coupland, who's in fact a finalist for the Eureka Prizes, which were on in the 23rd, 10 days' time, roughly. And what she does is have a scheme for the young people at school, and they're pretty young, some of them at primary school. They go out to a bit of wasteland in the middle of town, and it's urban forests. An urban forest the size of, say, a tennis court. And the first thing she does is say, you don't just plant the tree, because that soil has been there degraded for years, and you plant the poor tree. What's it going to do? Now, she shows them how to improve the soil, and then plants the tree which in a year is as tall as the kid who planted it. And apparently they're totally wrapped. And while through that practical process, they're learning about climate and science and being sceptical. Now those sorts of things are transforming the way the kids are learning and the teachers are teaching.
Look, I agree with you, Robyn. I think that's great. It's really, and it's what's needed. But we don't have time for the kids to save the world. Our job is to do it with the current people we have in positions of power today.
You've got to change minds now.
Yeah, and that's where this whole question of how you engage with climate skeptics takes on a new acuteness. Because we have to, that's what we have to do. And it's an incredibly difficult job. And we kind of open up the crack a bit at a time. Can I just tell you another story? So a couple of years ago, I went out to Young. I was invited out to speak about climate change. There was a number of progressive farmers there who wanted more climate action on the agenda from the local council. And they had managed to arrange a meeting between the mayor and a couple of councillors and these progressive farmers and myself and a few other people from the Climate Council, from the Australian Museum as well. So we went out there, and the mayor, it turns out, was an ex-shearer who, you know, probably didn't have the world's best education, was a bit dubious about the whole business, but was willing to give us the time of day, which was good of him, right? So my job was just to thank him for that. But he had two councillors there, one of whom was dressed up in a suit and tie, which I don't wear, you know, but he was perfectly groomed, ready to go. And he got up and spoke for 10 minutes about what perfidious idiots we were. Climate change was a load of rubbish and these people are wasting their time. I don't know why they've come out and all the rest of it. So anyway, I had to stand up at the end as the kind of representative of the group and just say to him, look, we have to disagree with you, but we respect you and would like to continue the dialogue. So over morning tea, I went up to him and just said, look, I'm Tim, you know, what's your name? We had a bit of a chat, very standoffish. But then I said, what do you do in town? And he said, I'm a musician. I said, oh, that's great. What do you play? He said, I play a piano accordion. And it just so happened that I'd taken my first piano accordion lesson about 2 weeks earlier. So I said, that's wonderful. I said, I've just had my first piano accordion lesson. And it was like the floodgates opened, you know. He said, what do you play? I said, a Honan. I've got a Honan. What do you play? So, and it was then on, we were good. And he said, you must come back to town and talk to us again. And sometimes I realised what his shtick was, right? He's a performer, right? So his shtick was being the old grumpy uncle at the Christmas dinner, you know, and he gets his kicks from everyone, pushing back, you know, like the young kids. And so once you break that down, though, and get down to the real human being under that, you can make some progress. So to me, the first thing you have to do when you deal with this is show people respect.
Find something in common.
Yep, show them respect, find some common ground, find a way of speaking with them at a level that's meaningful to them.
And learn piano accordion.
Exactly, well, if you have to, learn a piano accordion, exactly.
There can be a problem, however, when someone is so completely different and maybe in charge. Let me just read another final quotation. And this is between the philosopher Bertrand Russell, and he was one of the leaders of the campaign for nuclear disarmament. We nearly got arrested at the same time in Trafalgar Square, was it 100 years ago? And he went to jail and I didn't. But here's a letter, in fact, debating a fascist. He's writing to Sir Oswald Mosley, who was head of the British fascists. Thank you for your letter and for your enclosure. I have given some thought to your recent correspondence, and it is always difficult to decide on how to respond to people whose ethos is so alien and in fact repellent to one's own. It is not that I take exception to the general points made by you, but every ounce of my energy has been devoted to an active opposition to cruel bigotry, compulsive violence, and the sadistic persecution which has characterised the philosophy and practice of fascism. I feel obliged to say that the emotional universes we inhabit are so distinct and in deepest ways opposed that nothing fruitful or sincere could ever emerge from an association between us. I should like you to understand the intensity of this conviction on my part. It is not out of any attempt to be rude that I say this, but because of all that I value in human experience and human achievement. Yours sincerely, Bertrand Russell. To a fascist.
You've put this together very well, Robyn. Look, so we get to the really difficult point of the evening now, you know, which is...
No time,
no
fascists
time.
in charge, no.
Let's say a fascist in charge, a climate denier in charge. And you realise that what they are doing is, I don't know what the right term is, terroricide might be the right word, the murder of the planet, that their business is the murder of the planet. And therefore, they are destroying your children's future. And that's a moment of difficult decision, isn't it? Because what that begs us to think is that we need to step outside of the law. And the law is the only thing that holds our whole society together. I think about those people who demonstrated outside the CEO of Woodside's house in Perth just a few days ago. And I think about those who have glued themselves to coal, railway tracks carrying coal. And I find it very difficult to judge the morals of those positions. But what I can see, if we go back to Mosley, is that there is a backlash. Ultimately the scales have to be balanced. And you know, I grew up in the 50s and 60s. Robyn, I was born in 1956, and I still remember the horror of the Baader Meinhof gang in Germany. You know, these were young people who had grown up in post-war Germany and looked around them and saw that the Nazis of high repute, high position in the Nazi party, were still in positions of extraordinary authority and power in the Germany that they lived in. And that was intolerable to them, that there had been no justice, natural justice had been denied. So these people took it upon themselves to simply inflict justice upon some of those people. They kidnapped people, they murdered other people. And there is a lesson in that for all of us, that, you know, to lighten the tone a bit, Robyn, you know, the CEO of Woodside and others, if they ever go into an aged care facility and are sufficiently enfeebled, will be having their bottoms wiped by those whose world they've destroyed. Right? So there is the potential for some sort of retribution in the future. I don't know what form it will take, but these are issues that need to be talked about and dealt with now, before we get to that point of what would I say, the destruction of the law, the disregard of the law.
Yeah. When it comes to science, let me just say, when I started the science show in 1975, one of the first stories we did, and Matt Peacock, one of my colleagues, was very much instrumental in this, was against the problem of too much asbestos in the community. And we're immediately attacked as being left-wing loonies who are trying to bring down capitalism. And there were mines in Western Australia, and Whitnone and God knows what else, we were trying to undermine because we hated capitalists. And we said, no, the scientific evidence about asbestos is dire. And it took, what, 3, 4, 5 years before. The next thing that happened is we did reports in the science show about lead in petrol. Because the evidence about harming kids' brains, breathing in all this lead, especially if they were close to highways. And when I started the science show itself, the second item was preserving forests. You've got forests in Tasmania, haven't you? Possibly. Peter Hunt did some wonderful work on the Talai and all sorts of forestry, and how you need to understand how forests work, doing so many things for you. And I think the wonderful thing about science is that once you understand the stories, because asbestos is rubbish that you need to hide away in normal civilised communities from the buildings. We know that now. And similarly with forests, the value of them is demonstrable on so many levels. And this is a good story to tell young people. But then there's the problem of the internet and this Tower of Babel that is spreading so much stuff. Do you listen to what comes out? Do you watch what comes out of the social media?
But could I just comment on those two examples you brought? I mean, they're telling because they're so similar. So asbestos is now killing its probably second or third generation of people as young couples buy an old house and renovate it and pull out the asbestos and kill themselves. And those who are responsible for that, were they ever jailed? Because they knew about it all. Were they ever jailed? Was there ever any justice? No. Now lead, similar sort of thing. It's not just lead in petrol. Go to some of the major lead mines around Australia and look at lead levels in dust and look at the problem, the high blood lead levels in children in those communities, and then understand that all of that lead is sequestered in their bones, and when they give birth, the lead is mobilised and goes into their fetus to infect yet another generation. And what are we doing about that? Who is paying for that?
But there are better ways of doing things and we know what they are.
We
the
do,
good
but
news
we
is around.
But the justice is not there, right, for those things. And the same with forests. Our justice system was built around the protection of privilege, right, and the protection of wealth. That's why there's 40 crimes in Georgia and England which were punishable by death, which were all about property, or mostly about property. So, you know, we need to reimagine the justice system, right, in a very fundamental way, in my view, if we hope to have a better world.
We're coming shortly in a couple of minutes to questions from you, but I'm going to ask you about what you think having people's minds change by listening to some of the information about good science, good research. And I once went to Newcastle, well, a few months ago, and I met the professor of physics who told me, I think 15 years ago, he said, I'm going to work on how you can actually make solar cells so cheaply you could print them. And this guy is now printing them on a huge machine that's, you know, almost like printing wallpaper. And he took 1 kilo of his printing in the back of an electric car around Australia to 70 schools and said, every night I put out this solar stuff and I charge the car. I'm going around the country for nothing, and this is the future. You can put this stuff on the ceilings of warehouses which are too fragile to have the silicon. There are millions of stories like that of what can be done if we invest rather more than, I think, the amount of money, and we've got the President of the Academy of Science here this week for Beaker Street, it's 0.9% of GDP, which is the lowest in the OECD of the rich countries. If we invested.
Power to the people, Robyn. That's what it's all about, in so many ways. But you're right, technology is part of the solution. It absolutely is. And
technology and people working together like those kids planting tiny forests,
yep,
you know, which reduce the heat in towns by 5 degrees C. It's amazing. The work is there. Questions now. I can't quite see you because I've got light. There's one on the aisle over there. Please.
Thank you. It's better. Do you think that climate change actually started during the Industrial Revolution and it's just a cumulative effect? I don't think it's just really over the last 5 years, but it'll be over since the 1800s, a cumulative effect, because there's an enormous amount of pollution in the 1800s.
Yeah, look, it's certain that CO2 levels started very, very slightly increasing with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. But it was it was really only in probably the 1990s to 2000s that CO2 had built up sufficiently to start driving variation in a lot of the climate system beyond the natural variability, which was the problem we had, of course, because there's a lot of natural variability in the current climate system. In the climate system, sorry. You know, and in that regard, it's important to understand that over the last 15 to 20 years, humanity has released about a third of all of the CO2 that we've ever released in the history of our species. So the problem's growing quickly. So we're now breached that bounds of natural variability. We're outside those bounds now, and we can expect to see an increase in that rate of change for the next probably couple of decades, regardless of what we do.
Question?
Are you all right? I love it.
Oh, careful.
Hi, Robyn and Tim. Thank you. It's great to have you here in Hobart.
Thank you.
I was just wondering, so you're talking about, you know, talking to people and having respectful dialogues and things like that. Do you have any insight on how to initiate these? Like, how do you get out there and have respectful dialogues with people?
Play the piano accordion.
I'll do my best.
I guess, is it Lisa around? I can't.
It is.
Yeah, great to see you.
You too.
Look, I guess I was lucky in that I was paid to do it for a number of years as Australia's Climate Commissioner. That was my job. And since then I've been asked to address various groups. I don't know quite how you do it if you're not in that situation, but I imagine there's opportunities in terms of any community gatherings that you go to, you know, where someone might put a view that's not quite right. And it's then the challenge to deal with that in a respectful way. And
unfortunately, a lot of scientists, as it turns out, don't always get out there and have these opportunities, which is kind of a shame if you ask me. But
yeah, well, for sure. We need to make more of it.
Mm.
Tell me, when you went around the country with the council, when your colleagues did, you know, several of them, were you always greeted, or did you have a rough time, or what was it like having a town hall?
Look, we had a number of pretty difficult occasions. Someone, you know, it'd be a meeting like this with this number of people in a room, and we'd give our presentation, and someone would stand up and scream at us and rip up our paper that we'd given out and stomp out of the room.
Often was this?
Yeah, it was. Not, you know, perhaps, I don't know, 1 in 5 meetings. But when that happened, you know, and someone else started to complain or be rude, the audience shut them down, because the audience generally didn't want to be represented at a meeting like this where people had come to speak to them as a load of hooligans. And so people regulate their own neighbours, and people know who's speaking. Of course, in a small town, you know, everyone knows everyone. So I found that level of respect was reciprocated if you initiated it and kept with that.
Yeah, well, Leslie Hughes, who's one of your colleagues.
Yeah, she was with us through most of that.
She's just tremendous.
Yeah.
And she found mostly that you had civilised people turning up and having a reasonable conversation because you want to improve the future. It's all of your interests to have a civil society.
There's a whole lot of drivers in all of that with the meetings, you're quite right. But, you know, and perhaps we were self-selected, but there was, you know, just as many sceptics probably attracted to them as there was welded-on climate believers, if you want. But look, it was an extremely interesting experience, and it changed me. And I must say, the thing that I realised, in the end, you cannot expect to change people's minds unless your mind is open to change itself. And that was really the fundamental lesson for me of those meetings.
Lisa, you still have got the mic, have you?
Sure.
Do you find scientists speak up as much as you'd like?
No, absolutely not. But what I should have also asked you was, I don't think it's necessarily only scientists that can have those conversations. And sadly, because scientists often don't or can't, I mean, I'm not trying to put it off on, you know, everybody else that's here in the room, or everybody else that's on the planet, but I don't think it should only be left to anybody. I think everybody can.
Everybody.
Yeah, everybody can have those conversations.
Thank you.
No, you're absolutely right, and you know, anyone who has children has every right to say, you know, look, what you're saying there will have a bad impact on my children. You're damaging my children's future, and to have a debate on that basis.
And what would you do to the internet?
I don't.
I refused to have a mobile phone for 40 years. Were they 40 years old? Can't remember.
Yeah.
And they gave me one because I have to get a particular sort of discount thing on the screen, but I never use it for anything else because pernicious stuff keeps coming up on it every 5 seconds. It's amazing. The Tower of Babel for bullshit.
But doesn't the internet only amplify what's already there?
Yeah, that's the problem.
Yes, well, why expect anything more or different of it? It's not a revolutionary tool in that way. I don't know, Robyn. I think it's...
If it's just radio, it's fine.
But what we've got to do is teach people a decent degree of scepticism. That's the thing. Radio is fine, absolutely. But for the internet, you know, young people are best served if they are schooled in a reasonable degree of scepticism.
Here's a magazine. It's called The Skeptic.
Yes.
I'll leave it for the first person to grab it on the... And The Skeptic are the scientifically minded people, as well as outside science as well, and it's critical thinking. Who else is there? Can I see someone? There's one there.
There's one right in the front
One
here.
there.
If any young people have a question? I always want to hear from the young.
Young is a relative word.
Thank you. I'm not young. Sorry. I really appreciate your conversation, Tim and Robyn. We have scientists who've been having this conversation for a really long time in Tasmania, and one of our really outspoken scientists has given up so much conversation, has gone as a direct action forest defender, and she is a scientist of, she's a veterinary scientist, and now she's in jail for 3 months for defending Tasmania's wild places. So how are scientists that want to take that conversation, that further step of direct action, going to achieve change?
This is what terrifies me, because when the law is wrong, we have a moral obligation to oppose the law. But if you look at the path ahead of you from that, where do we stop opposing the law? Where is the line between doing that and a formation of a new environmental Baader-Meinhof gang? And that's the question we all need to ask ourselves. Because without the law we have nothing. Without a common understanding of what our society is, we have nothing. So I don't have any guidance for that. I can see why people do what they do, but the trend as a whole leaves me deeply concerned.
Greta
I wish we could change the law.
Thunberg has just been arrested.
Exactly.
Charged.
You know, perhaps we need to try to change the law. But I can understand why those white people would oppose the law, because the forest is being felled right there and it is wrong. But can you see why I'm slightly apprehensive about where that might end up?
Yes, it's a conundrum, but it's the urgency of the situation is what concerns people so much, and all the attempts to change the law and to do things by the law just seem to lead to nowhere.
Yeah, I understand that. I do.
The story's got nothing to do particularly with what we've been talking about. Quite some time ago, several of us were involved in trying to stop the 70s tour of the Springboks. We were anti-apartheid in every way you could imagine, and Peter Hain was the leader.
Robyn as well in Melbourne.
Yeah, Peter Hain, who was a minister, actually from South Africa. He became a minister in the British government and then became Minister for Wales, but encouraging us. And what we thought we'd do is we'd interfere with the coach carrying the Springboks, but nobody dared. And so we went home and told about a bunch of people, actually, most from Oxford. and said, well, we thought we'd do this, but nobody did do it. And there's a fellow called Michael Deeney, said, I'll do that. That's a great idea. And the following day, he went to the Strand Hotel, and he was dressed in a suit. Got to be careful about this. And he went into the coach where most of the Springboks were aboard, and he said to the driver, there's a reroute because there's going to be a blockage. The police are saying, would you go inside? He got off, the driver got off, and Deeney went into the seat, took chains from up his sleeves and chained himself to the wheel. And that's all he was supposed to do. But then he noticed the keys in the ignition. He never driven a bus, but he turned it on and worked out the gears and drove off. And somebody, the second row forward said, hey, hang on, mate. Dolly de Villiers, the captain, is not on board. You've got to wait for the captain. And Michael turned around and said, although you're all kidnapped. And one of the second row forwards punched him in the face and broke his jaw. And he went into it. Anyway, he escaped. And in fact, the granddaughter of Sir Henry Parkes, Pat Goldacre, actually drove Michael Deeney to the airport to escape the police. There you are, there's a story. That's how to deal with what's illegal.
Exactly. But can I just say that your questions actually sparked something in me, because who owns the forest? The Crown owns the forest. The Crown is not us. We actually own the forest. We Tasmanians, we Australians own the forest, right? Not the Crown. The Crown gives away the forest to those who pay the highest price, right? So the fundamental understanding of the law, this neo-colonial confection that we've created, is the ultimate fault here. Tasmanian Aboriginals knew who owned the forest. It was them. Right? I've worked in the Solomon Islands and PNG with people in exactly the same situation. They own the forest. The government gives a licence to someone to cut down the forest. They burn the logging vehicles. Very simple.
Did you see the film Giants?
So I would... Well, no, I haven't. But I'd just like to say we need to reinforce to the government of Tasmania that we, the people, own the forests. This fiction of the Crown owning the forests and being able to give it away is invidious. We need to reimagine what it means to be real citizens of this nation and this state, and what that entails in terms of ownership and obligations.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, audience, for your questions.